Hello, welcome to the Deadly Analysis podcast. This is our shortcut segment where we talk about broad horror movie questions, more creative film pitch meetings. These are the things that allow our creative juices to get flowing. And so we will be exploring a question this evening: how to improve an ongoing horror franchise. I'm here with Ben. Say hi, Ben.
Hello, viewers and listeners.
And we're going to be talking about how to improve an ongoing horror franchise. This was a viewer suggestion in our in one of our other shortcut segments. And so if you have any other questions that you'd like to see Ben and I explore, please leave them in the comments below. So the ongoing horror franchise that I would improve is the Cloverfield franchise. Now, if you're familiar with this franchise, you'll know that it's 3 films: the original Cloverfield, 10 Cloverfield Lane, and the Cloverfield Paradox. The first 2 were generally well received, but the last one, which went straight to Netflix in this sort of Super Bowl PR splash, was not well received. So the question is what do we do with this franchise going forward? Now, the Cloverfield Paradox and 10 Cloverfield Lane, behind the scenes, those were repurposed scripts that were then sort of shoved into a Cloverfield universe. The original Cloverfield, on the other hand, was actually written directly for the screen as a Cloverfield movie. It's actually the only true Cloverfield movie in a 3-film franchise. So what do I want to do with the Cloverfield franchise now? I want to write an actual Cloverfield movie. But in this case, instead of found footage like the first Cloverfield film, and instead of rather typical narrative film that 10 Cloverfield Lane and Cloverfield Paradox had, I am going to take the same style as the last year's movie Searching, where everything takes place on a computer screen. So this is the new found footage. This is the new new frontier, if you will, in creative filmmaking and visual storytelling that is not sort of traditional narrative structure. So Searching, if you haven't seen it, is an entire movie that just takes place on a guy's computer screen. That's what we see. The movie screen is a guy's computer screen, and it's a fantastic movie. So how am I going to turn this into the Cloverfield Paradox or Cloverfield universe? I'm going to have the entire action take place on military computers as the military attempts to fight the Cloverfield monsters after they have invaded the Earth. We can put in a few Easter eggs with previous Cloverfield characters, not including T.J. Miller, of course. We could put in a few Easter eggs with Mary Elizabeth Winstead, but almost everything is going to take place on the military computer screen as they're fighting the Cloverfield monsters. So that's my pitch for the new Cloverfield movie, an actual Cloverfield movie, as opposed to a repurposed script made into a Cloverfield movie. What do you think, Ben?
So I'm liking the tie-in with the technology piece. What I'm curious about is what deeper significance that might have for this particular type of movie. Why would you make that creative choice in particular?
Because, first of all, I think that the computer screen life format is to today what found footage was to the time when the original Cloverfield was released. So I think that there's kind of an interesting parallel between film techniques in the computer life and what found footage was when Cloverfield was released. I also think that this is the next step in the franchise. Cloverfield Paradox was essentially, spoilers for Cloverfield Paradox, it's essentially an origin story of the Cloverfield monsters. Cloverfield is a couple of street level folks trying to fight or evade rather, the Cloverfield monsters, and 10 Cloverfield Lane is a sort of it's like Bug for the first 2 acts, and then it becomes a Cloverfield movie in the last act. Nothing except the original Cloverfield has actually been something that is devoted to talking about the Cloverfield monsters and dealing with that problem in a real way. And the people who are dealing with the Cloverfield monsters are the military. So it makes sense that the military computer would be the one that we're watching, and it also makes sense in sort of a parallel film techniques that we use the life of a computer rather than found footage.
No, that's really interesting. I'm curious to see if something like this. Now, I'm not sure if you have examples, because like finding the next found footage, I think would be really cool. You know, this is a technique obviously that took off like crazy. I guess starting with Blair Witch, I guess is where it
Right.
originated, I believe. Yeah. And it's an absolutely sort of like unpredictable phenomenon. I mean, it's like how weird that this particular type of thing took off in the way that it did. So if you're able to kind of like spark life into a new sort of really interesting technique that kind of resonates well with, you know, people of a particular generation, I think that definitely has a lot of potential there, and it makes sense the way that you're tying it into the original story as well.
Yeah, I think that the found footage existed before Blair Witch, but then Blair Witch sort of exploded it, and then it had its imitators in Cloverfield and Chronicle. But I think that there have been other sort of computer life films like Unfriended, which didn't necessarily do all that well, and Searching, which also didn't do terribly well at the box office, yet it was in my top 10 last year. I think Searching is an incredible movie. If it were a horror movie, I'd already put it on the list, but I think it's more of like a mystery thriller. It doesn't really have many horror elements to it, but I do want to take that style and put it into the horror genre, and I think it would work well. So what about you, Ben? What's your ongoing horror franchise that you want to pitch? How would you save an ongoing horror franchise?
So the horror franchise that I want to improve is something that we've talked a lot of smack about on this podcast in particular. What I want to work on is the Conjuring Universe. So just as a quick recap on that, the Conjuring Universe is comprised of the original Conjuring movie in 2013, the Conjuring 2 in 2016, and then several spin-off movies starting with Annabelle in 2014, Annabelle Creation in 2017, The Nun in 2018, The Curse of La Llorona in 2019, and then this year we also have Annabelle Comes Home, so the most recent two will be releasing in the same year. And I do like this concept. I really do enjoy the fact that they're creating a universe and sort of taking kind of like the same approach that we see with Marvel. The MCU is incredibly successful, and so I think people really resonate with having kind of like these interconnected stories that sort of exist alongside of each other, where perhaps in certain moments they converge. It's a great storytelling technique, and it allows you a lot of freedom to explore a lot of character development and complexity and nuance, which are all incredibly important, of course, for the horror genre, because really I think the only way to speak to kind of like some of these deeper, more interesting fears that we have as a species, as the human race, is this kind of layering effect where you are allowed time for development, where you are allowed time for kind of like nuance and a little bit more of an exploratory freedom that you can just sort of like pack into a 2-hour movie. I mean, it really, really is a strength, I think, that they've chosen to spread this out over multiple movies that aren't necessarily sequels. They exist in the same universe. It's a very cool idea. The problem, unfortunately, is that they really just sort of squander that opportunity on drivel. You know, I mean, even the critics sort of like seem to agree with this. Like the original Conjuring has an 85% on Rotten Tomatoes. Okay, interesting. It comes alongside sort of like that Paranormal Activity phenomenon, or the, you know, the Amityville, whatever horror house, like the haunted Hill House, the Haunting on Hill House, or whatever it was. Like, I mean, there are a lot of stories where we have, you know, this sort of like this home, and there's something crazy going on, and maybe some paranormal researchers come in. You know, maybe that's found footage kind of thing. Maybe it's kind of like where they have in Paranormal, where it's just sort of like set up security footage, or maybe it's in the more traditional format. But it's like it was sort of like a big trend and kind of like a style of movie that people really seem to resonate with, and so that's totally fine. But immediately after that, Annabelle crashes at a rating of 29%, a critic's consensus at 29%. The Conjuring 2 then comes back pretty strong at 80%, and Annabelle Creation at 70%. Okay, that's a little bit better. But then The Nun crashes out at 26%. The Curse of La Llorona is a 30%. And so far, Annabelle Creation up a little bit is 68%. But really, just in general, even the critics' consensus on this, which is usually generally positive for these kinds of movies, I feel like, is sort of inconsistent. Like they just can't seem to hit a rhythm. So I think the reason for that is because they really just rely too heavily on just cheap jump scares. And that's really not a good way to set up a horror film or just like even a universe of horror films, right? Like, I mean, if you have this creative freedom to go and explore deeper fears and have these multi-layered stories, why would you squander that on jump scares and creepy monsters? Now, it's fine to have interesting antagonists and sort of like demons and devils and, you know, whatever monster it is that you have your main character sort of contending with, whether that's something corporeal, maybe it's something a little more abstract, that's totally fine. That can be really, really interesting. But again, it's all just really about kind of like maybe a sort of creepy atmosphere and like the sharp peaking music and something jumps out around a corner or like something has a crazy mouth. You know, I mean, it's so tired and so done that even the general public seems to be rejecting this style of movie. And it is what it is. So what they really need to do is sort of stop doing that. I mean, maybe it's too late now. They need to stop relying on these cheap jump scares and give themselves a little time to explore what these different sort of incantations and monsters or whatever, what they might really represent. Why is it that people really seem to like this haunted doll thing? You know, right now there's actually a short film on the Alter channel on YouTube called The Doll Maker. And they use the same kind of thing where you have this doll that sort of becomes the embodiment of a lost loved one or child, you know, whatever it is. And I think it's along the same lines as kind of like an Annabelle, right? Where it's like you have this inanimate object, but then it in some way represents sort of like a soul or a spirit or an animated person. But this short film is so good because they thread suggestions about the main sort of twist they have at the end throughout the entire story, which is it's less than 10 minutes. And then they give you this really interesting payoff that has nothing to do with, oh my gosh, look at this creepy doll. It's something about interpersonal struggle and loss and death. And it's amazing. It's utterly amazing. The storytelling is incredible. And they still use the doll trope, but they use it to symbolize something a little bit deeper. And that's what I think the Conjuring universe really needs to do. La Llorona, it's about, you know, it's like this lady essentially or something like that. I only saw it the one time, but it's like she's sort of like chasing children, like she's trying to kill children because of a little bit that you see in her backstory. The Nun, you have like these religious things, this crazy thing that happened to this woman that turned her into this like this apparition, this monster. You know, religious themes in horror movies are absolutely fantastic. Some of my favorites have this in it: Antichrist, The Witch, Hagazusa. It's an incredible foundation for exploring why we have faith and what that says about our fears of death, about the unknown, about the afterlife. And they touch none of that. None of that. It's all jump scare, and it's so ridiculous. So that's what they really need to do. They need to stop relying on the bullcrap. They need to go ahead and keep their structure. They can keep their monsters, but they need to start exploring something a little bit deeper than just like the traditional kind of like cheap horror tropes that we see so many times.
So basically, your pitch is make it better. That it's essentially you want to, you know, do away with all the shitty elements and make it better, right? You know, deeper themes, deeper ideas. Yeah, I mean, I think that I would love for them to do that because I've literally not enjoyed a single Conjuring film aside from sort of a surface enjoyment. And I think the Warrens are interesting characters, right? The Warrens spent their lives, you know, working on paranormal investigations, and there's probably an interesting story there. I think they did get caught up in the horror movie elements and then forgot their main characters. That may be, you know, that may be part of the fix there. So how would you go about, like, what are some more specific things of like how you would go about fixing this thing? Like, what would you, what would you do? What would a perfect Conjuring Universe movie be for you?
Well, I think my pitch would be a little bit more than just I think just making it better. So I
Oh
really
yeah,
want to see
okay. So maybe it was a little. I didn't mean to.
no, it's fine. It's fine. So if we're going to use, okay, so the Conjuring, the two original Conjuring movies, okay, so they want to use this sort of like paranormal investigation thing as a foundation. I think that can be potentially interesting because whenever you start thinking about ghosts, like if that's your main thing, if you want to talk about a haunted house, I think what we really need to see explored there is why is it that people believe that something is left behind when there is trauma in a person's life that causes this sort of apparition to exist, right? I mean, there's definitely a strong theme of loss and death there that can be explored beyond just a jump scare, beyond just, okay, like I'm waiting for this thing, then ooh, a scary face or scary monster, right? So what they really need to do, I think, is explore those themes in the Conjuring universe. In the Conjuring original two Conjuring movies, like their foundational layer, kind of like their Avengers, essentially, their Avengers movies. They need to look at the broad theme for the entire universe, which is going to be why is it that we leave something behind whenever there's trauma in our lives? Why do we believe that there's something left unfinished? Where does that come from? How do we play that out? How do we explore that a little bit more deeply? Then in the individual movies, like in Annabelle, I mean, we really need, I think there's an opportunity there. And apparently those are already kind of like decent, I guess, from critical consensus. But I mean, maybe not our consensus.
Yeah, I mean,
consensus.
I saw Annabelle Creation, and it didn't. There were a lot of jump scares, and
right
for me, yeah, it's
So
all of the like I think your criticisms are right on. I want to like work with you on kind of like honing the fixes for it. And that's
exactly right. So for Annabelle, what I really want them to look into is not necessarily creepy doll jump scare. It needs to be more about why do we find that particular type of thing creepy? Like what is it exactly that we find creepy about kind of like inanimacy? And I think like obviously that's sort of played out. I mean, it's really kind of a tired trope. I don't like that they went with like a doll movie because like we've had that for years. It's fine, I guess, but really only as a vehicle. They can use that, but it really needs to be more about kind of like why is that? I don't know why
right.
Why is this spirit attached to this object? What does that mean for that particular spirit? You know, it needs to go beyond more about like this thing is just kind of like out there trying to kill. It needs to be something more interesting, like kind of like the Babadook, I think, is a really good example of where you have, you know, this situation where you've got a family in a home. The home seems to be haunted, but it's really more about the tension between the relationships, right? So, I mean, that's kind of interesting. And that, I think, could be played out really well by, instead of having like this crazy sort of shadow monster, that could be represented by a doll, like so easily. Sure. So easily. You could tie all those negative emotions that are between those relationships to this object. And I think that would be really interesting.
I like like I think that this idea is, well, first of all, studios would greenlight this in a minute because it's taking the television model and putting it into theaters. It's serializing your story, and therefore you get $11 every time somebody watches an episode, and they have to watch the other 20 episodes in order to understand this episode. So it's a thing that studios would greenlight immediately. And I like the idea of making The Conjuring actually have thematic relevance. That's good. So yeah, anything else you want to add to your pitch so that when the viewers vote, they'll choose you over me?
Well, clearly, I think the Conjuring universe is something that a lot of people have like really sort of glommed onto. So I think I already have that on my side. People already, in general, sort of like most of the Conjuring movies. So I think just sort of like tweaking that a little bit to maybe be a little bit more scary than a jump scare. That's really what I'm selling here. Guys, we can do better. We can go deeper. We can go farther. We can really explore what true fear is. And a perfect way to do that is through a cinematic universe, of course, like we're both sort of talking about kind of the same thing, but in particular in the Conjuring universe, because they're able to have the creative freedom to symbolize fear in a myriad different ways. It's already it can get there. They just have to stop relying on the crap.
I think I mean, certainly more people have seen a Conjuring movie than have seen a Cloverfield movie. So we will see. You will be able to vote right up there or maybe it's right up there. I don't know. But it's in the card. But you'll be able to vote. Which one would you greenlight? My fixes for the Cloverfield franchise or Ben's fixes for the Conjuring franchise. Please vote and comment below, like, share, subscribe, and join us every Sunday for our roundtable discussions of some of the best horror movies. Thank you for watching this episode of Deadly Analysis Shortcuts.